Today on Carcass, we go hunting for a new project vehicle.
And what we find at the junkyard isn't in the best shape, but will it run?
We'll find out today on Carcass. Jimmy and I are in Car Guy Paradise. We're at Bobby White Motors here in Columbia, Tennessee, and pretty much everywhere we turn, there's something interesting to look at. Kind of like this Spider-Man Firebird thing.
Kind of a lost cause. The cool thing about salvage yards is you can pretty much find any part for any car that you're working on. I have an OBS GMC truck that's very similar to these GM full-size SUVs. And like on this Tahoe, you got a really good front fender, you have a nice hood other than the paint, and you even have a good core support. And if you haven't been to a salvage yard like this, they're actually really organized. Like just in this row, you have full-size GM SUVs and trucks, you have full-size GM cars in one spot over there, and by Jeremy, you have full-size Ford trucks.
We're pretty much two kids in a giant candy store out here, and Jimmy and I just keep walking around going, why would anybody scrap that out? Or you could completely build this truck. Take this old Ford. Yes, the motor's missing, but the hood is actually in the back of the truck. You could easily pluck this out of the salvage yard, put an engine in it, and put it back out on the farm for good use. You could even teach your kids how to drive. But I really don't think this is what we're looking for.
Yeah, we're really looking for the right vehicle for our next project, and hopefully we can find something pretty interesting.
You know, I hate to say it, but there's an awful lot of Fords out here. $17, $18, $19. You know, we could put a Jeep together with this entire row.
They got 3/4 ton axles up near the front too, but it's still just a Jeep.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Jeremy and I couldn't really decide what we wanted to take home with us, and then we ran across this crusty old square body.
Yeah, it's a mid-70s, late 70s C30. Somebody's got a wrecker body on the back of it. I don't know, this thing's got a ton of potential.
And the nice thing is that this is probably one of the most complete vehicles in the salvage yard. We've came across a few that could maybe run and drive under their own power, but I think this is our best option.
This truck checks all the boxes that Jimmy and I are looking for. It's a square body Chevy pickup. It's got the classic patinaed exterior, and it's one of the most popular trucks being put back on the road. Looks like it's got an old tried and true small block in it. It's missing some of the parts.
Alternator's gone, but we don't really need one, I guess. A battery, obviously.
Carburetor.
Yeah.
Find one of them. And the biggest upside to this one, it's got all the tires on it.
Yeah, I think they're all holding air too. I didn't see a flat one, which is good.
I think we're good. It's rusty, but it looks complete, at least.
So the dash is cracked, the seat's kind of ripped up, and hopefully you can see this. There's like a giant hole in the floor. And obviously that's unsafe for a bunch of different reasons, but I think if we kind of leave the outside as is and just spruce up the interior, make it safe and nice, that's probably a pretty good way to go about it.
Well, the outside tire's flat, but the inside tire's holding there. Oh, we got some big issues on the chassis. There's a giant hole clean through the frame, right where the leaf spring hanger rivets right to the chassis. And being from the Rust Belt, that's something I've seen before, but there's a good reason why this truck's in the junkyard. Like at any point in time, the chassis could literally just V right in half and lay this thing right on the ground. But you know, it's something Jimmy and I can completely handle. I don't know, man. We got some major issues with the chassis. I see you found a giant hole in the passenger floor. The truck is complete. Is this really something we want to tackle?
Maybe. I mean, this is the most unique thing we could have found in a salvage yard.
Right.
So it's kind of like, how different do you want to be?
No, totally. I'm on board if you're on board.
Yeah. I mean, we'll take a shot at it. It should come out pretty nice.
I think so.
I think it'll run too, right here.
I'll bet it'll run.
Just needs a couple things.
Yeah. So all we really need to get this thing going, I think, is a battery. We're missing the carburetor, so we'll bring one of those. Some fuel, a hope and a prayer, and we'll bring the trailer back tomorrow. We'll try to get this thing back to the shop.
Up next, we find out if our 1977 C30 tow truck has any rumble left in it.
You're watching Carcass.
Jeremy and I took a night to think about it, and we're back with the truck and trailer because we're ready to take on our next challenge.
I hope she runs.
We've been hunting through Bobby White Motor Salvage Yard in Columbia, Tennessee, and I think Jeremy and I have finally found our next project. This is a 1977 C30 with a wrecker body on the rear, and this thing needs some work, a lot of work. But it's such a unique find, we're determined to get it running so we can take it home.
Well, we popped our head underneath here yesterday and we knew we needed some parts, so we grabbed that from the shop. So let's get the carburetor on it. We'll throw an alternator at it and we'll put a battery in this thing.
Yeah, we'll check the oil too, make sure we're not running it dry. And to be honest, like, we only need to run this thing for a couple minutes just to get on the trailer. And worst case is we're on a hill anyway, so we can kind of coast it down and then just winch it up.
Yeah, we'll make sure we check the brakes too.
Yeah.
Hope these are wired right. It's kind of the last little bit. Can you check the fluids quick?
It does have oil. It's brown.
Is it clean?
It's actually not as dark as I thought it would be, but
As long as it's got
there.
something. That's a rusted clamp. Glug, glug, glug. I think the filler's over here. Am I
on the
wrong?
other side.
Or it's on that side too. Don't spill much. That should be enough. All right, moment of truth, hop in, Jimmy. Brakes-ish?
No, not really. They're hydro boost, so
Okay.
they're not really gonna work unless
I'm gonna stand on this side, crank on it a little bit.
E-brake might work.
I would be shocked.
E-brake works.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, it actually works.
All right, cool. Go for it. Cranks. Hey, there's fuel up in the fuel filter. Keep doing that. All right. It runs. It runs. Dude, it actually
It's
runs.
idling by itself.
Oh, it actually runs.
Yeah,
I wonder if they just brought it here because of the chassis.
maybe.
Somebody took parts off it. I mean, it's loud, it's got exhaust leaks and all this other stuff, but
Yeah,
wow.
it's a little bit lumpy.
Should we see if it moves?
Huh?
You want to see if it moves?
Yeah, you want to
take
close
the
the hood?
stuff out from under the hood, but let's see if it moves.
Yeah, close the hood and we'll see.
Oh, nice hood. It sounds terrible. Wow, look at this thing. There, she's a rocket ship. Wow. All right, I'll go move the truck and trailer.
Okay. I want to see if let's see if the wrecker works.
Oh, I never thought of that. Will this sit here without rolling away?
Yeah, I got the e-brake on.
Oh, no, that's right, it works. Yeah, all right.
I think this is a clutch lever.
I don't know. Oh,
All right.
that, whatever he did was the wrong one.
Hold on.
Oh, wait, here. I got it. Pull this one back. Pull that into gear. This goes in here. Okay, got that? All right, now let that one out.
Oh!
Stop before it breaks. Okay, here. Now watch. Now we'll go down. I think. Okay, go down. Oh!
That's cool.
There's no way. We should tow a car out of here.
Yeah, another project.
One to know.
No, yeah, that's fine.
Let's take her back to the shop.
Up next, we dig into our patina tow truck, and what we find is not surprising. We brought this junkyard find back to the shop to give it a good top to bottom inspection to see if we missed anything at Bobby White Motors.
Needless to say, this truck has some character and a lot of rust. Some of it contributes to the patinaed look that both Jimmy and I like. But in other places, well, it's gonna cause a few headaches.
Rust aside, we have some ideas for what we want to do with this unique find, like what we plan to do with the doors. We partnered with Wyotech to do some rebranding on this work truck.
So we shipped the doors off to be worked on while we brainstormed some ideas for this truck.
And here's what we came up with. Our goal is to get this old square body back on the road and make it safe again. So the first thing we're gonna have to do is address the rusted out chassis under the bed out back. Those are the danger points, and those are the most important things to get fixed first.
Then we'll pump this old square body with a little more power and an automatic transmission to match. After some power upgrades, we'll move to the inside and spruce up this 50-year-old interior. We'll do this by tackling the floor repairs first. Then we'll throw in a new dash, new instrument cluster, a steering wheel, and a nice seat to match.
Finally, we'll tackle the wheels and tires with a rattle can refresh, turning back the clock on this old work truck. Well, at least in the wheel department.
This all starts with some disassembly.
Removing the wrecker body out back will take a little more work than just a normal pickup bed would take. We have to completely disassemble the tow rig before we can separate it from the truck. For starters, we need to unhook the suspension cables that hold this arm in place. Then with it lowered, we can unbolt it at the hinge points. With it loose, Jimmy and I can slide it out and set it aside for now.
With the arm out of the way, we can put our focus on the triangular frame support. With 50 years of rust, this created some challenges with the bolts, and in some cases, we found it easier just to cut them off rather than to try and unbolt them in those tight areas.
What you can't see here is a puddle of molten metal forming as the torch heats up the nut. Once you see the puddle form, you pull the trigger, and the oxygen not only raises the temperature to make the puddle flow, but the pressure also helps clear the slag. With those hard to reach fasteners out of the way, we have a couple more mounting bolts to break free.
All right, so the last thing, the rear leaf spring hangers are welded to the back of the box.
Yeah, I saw that.
Geniuses that put this together thought that was a good idea, so we got to get those apart.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to do it is we'll just grab the old fire stick again. We'll just torch out the back. It's going to be way quicker to deal with it with the box off. Then we'll figure out how to fix it after that.
Yep.
All right. The box out back is made of 3/16 steel, and a torch will make quick work of cutting out a section, so we can finally lift the box off the chassis and get a closer look at what we're working with.
With both sections cut out on the back, we're going to use the lift to help us raise up the bed.
Yep. Let me show you guys why we had to cut the wrecker body off of the chassis. Now, the wrecker body is a universal fit body. It fits many different makes and models. And when they put it on the back of our Chevy truck, they actually cut the back of the frame off. And by doing that, they cut the rear leaf spring hanger off as well. Now, to give it a little more support, when they put the body back on this truck, they welded the wrecker body to this rear leaf spring hanger in a bunch of areas that Jimmy and I just couldn't get to. So that's why we had to make this big cut to get the body off the truck.
And now that we have the box off the chassis, Jeremy and I can get a much better look at the rust, and it's a lot worse than we originally thought. This whole side of the frame rail right here is just completely wiped out. So what we were thinking is maybe cut this section of the frame rail out and replace it, but now we actually think it'd be easier to cut the chassis somewhere back here and completely replace both frame rails.
Coming up, we're cutting out the rust.
But before we can do that, there's more we need to strip.
You're watching Carcass.
Our 1977 tow truck is a unique find, but all those years spent rescuing vehicles on the side of the road were not kind to this old moneymaker. The key word here is rust. Anywhere water was able to sit and touch metal left a mark. And I'm sure that dirt and debris like this did not help this old chassis.
The patinaed look of this truck is why Jimmy and I fell in love with it. It's why we pulled it out of the junkyard. But the question here is, what are we going to do with this thing? Well, we're going to give it a second chance at life. We're going to put it back on the road. And the front's going to get a bunch of horsepower. The interior is going to get all spruced up, be nice, comfy, and cozy. In the back, we're definitely going to make it safe again, and heck, we might even tow with it. But the real issue here is rust. There's a big difference between cosmetic rust and structural rust. Well, how are we going to fix that? Well, we could just go out, get a whole new frame. We could come in, cut the bad metal out, and replace it with some good steel. Or we could just cut the back half of this truck off and start over again. And that's what Jimmy and I are going to do. But before we get to throwing any sparks, there's a bunch of parts and pieces we got to get off this thing.
We'll start with the drive shaft. Decades of rust have made it difficult to remove the bolts and pry the sucker loose. A pry bar helped free up the U-joint. And since this is a two-piece drive shaft with a hanger bearing, we also have to unbolt the connection to the transmission. With those loose, we can wiggle it free and slide it aside for now.
Next, we need to remove the gas tank. A quick tip, if you can, empty the gas tank before you remove it. It's a lot easier working with your coworker when you don't stink like old octane for the rest of the day. The last thing we need to do is cut the winch linkages that span the length of the truck.
Like Jeremy mentioned earlier, there's a couple different ways we could go about repairing the rust in this chassis. The first way is to cut out this section of the damaged chassis and try and recreate it. The problem with that is the metal around it is so bad that we'd have to extend that section all the way up into this radius portion. Trying to recreate this radius would take so much time and effort to match it perfectly that I think our time is better spent elsewhere. So we're going to opt to cut the entire back half of the chassis off and recreate it using C-channel and rectangular tubing. We're not going to get there today, but we still need to cut this chassis apart. So now, where exactly do we cut the chassis? Looking at this bottom surface, I can see that the metal is really pitted and it's just not structurally sound. But the closer that we get to the back of the cab, the metal becomes relatively less pitted or not pitted at all, and that's a great starting point for us to make a cut.
There's a little prep work we need to do prior to making this cut. First, we'll take a pinion angle measurement while the truck is sitting on level ground. Next, we need to get a wheelbase measurement. We do this by measuring center to center of each wheel. With that out of the way, we're ready to cut.
We're using an acetylene torch to make this cut, and there are a few things to note about the cut you get with a torch like this. First, you won't be able to weld immediately after this cut. The slag left behind from it leaves a rough surface and is very porous, so expect to do some grinding to clean it up. Second, it's really tough to freehand a straight line, so expect to do some cleanup with a grinder once you get the two pieces separated.
Oh yeah! Easy peasy.
Our tow truck is now ready for a new rear end. And if you would like to follow along with this build, go to PowerNationTV.com.
Today on Carcass, we recreate the rear section of the chassis on our Junkyard Fine tow truck.
How we rebuild this crusty C-channel, giving this tow truck a second chance at life.
You're watching Carcass. We picked up this 1977 C30 tow truck in a local junkyard. It was mostly together with a few things missing under the hood and a flat tire out back.
We fell in love with this rusty old work truck, and with a little work getting it started, we decided this patinaed moneymaker would be our next project vehicle.
When we brought this thing back to the shop, we tore right into it, looking for the problem areas. Yep. And boy, did we run into every car guy's nightmare. Not only did we find cosmetic rust, but we also found some structural rust. Jimmy and I were just glad this thing didn't break in half as we rolled it into the shop.
We thought long and hard about what to do with this chassis, and we agreed. The rust, it had to go. So we fired up the torch and nixed the rear section of this frame. We made cuts on either side just behind the cab, dividing the truck in two.
Now we have two halves of a truck. We kept the rear half so we can pull a measurement later, and as for the front, if the truck wasn't roadworthy before, it certainly isn't now.
The plan is to rebuild the back end of this chassis, and that involves us forming new sections of C-channel. The new sections will replace the old sections from about here to here. Everything behind that, we're going to use 4-inch tall rectangular tubing, and because the tubing is so much shorter than the new channel, we'll have to gusset the tubing to the channel to ensure it's a strong joint. We plan on building the entire back end on a fixturing table to make sure everything is square and true. So the first step in this process is to grab some measurements and bend up our new C-channel. All right, let's see. 7 3/8, 2 3/4.
To build our C-channel, we're going to be using 3/16 sheet steel. And if you add up our measurements from the original chassis, you get roughly 13 inches. And we're replacing 30 inches before we transition to the rectangular tubing. We'll connect the dots, giving us a cutting line to follow with the plasma torch.
We're going to use a straight edge to help guide us along this cut. We'll line the tip of our torch up with our cut line and just clamp the straight edge in place. Butting our torch up against the edge of our yardstick, we can begin cutting.
After our first cut, we'll reset the straight edge and finish the cut. We'll follow that up with a 7-inch grinder to clean up the jagged edges that were left behind by the plasma torch.
While Jeremy cuts out another piece for our other piece of C-channel, I'm going to show you guys how we map out the bends. For our new chassis section, we're going to be nesting a new piece of C-channel in the existing piece of C-channel on the truck. And to do that, we're going to need to know one very specific piece of information. That's the inside radius of the bend that comes off the brake. The reason why we need to know that is because there's a specific amount of material taken up in each bend. And for us to accurately place our bend lines on our flat sheet, we need to know what this radius is. So to figure that out, we need to make a test bend and grab a set of drill bits. Now that we have the test bend made, the best thing to do is just grab a really big drill bit and take the shank of the drill bit and put it on the inside radius of the bend. I'm going to look up at the light, and the drill bit is so big that there's an air gap between the inside radius and the shank. So what you're going to do is just keep going down in drill bit size until that air gap is no longer visible. I've already done this with our piece, so I know that a 17/64 drill bit closes that air gap. Again, I know that because I look up at the light and the air gap is no longer visible. But this is a diameter and we need a radius. So 17/64 divided by 2 is 17/128, and that's gonna help us figure out where to place our bend lines on the flat sheet. We know that the height of our new C-channel can be no taller than 7 3/8 of an inch. We know this because we took a measurement off the truck chassis earlier. But there's a couple things we need to consider to get this right. The first being the thickness of our material. We're just using 3/16 sheet, so we know that each flange is 3/16 of an inch tall. The second thing we need to consider is the height of the bend itself. Now, we used a drill bit to figure out what the radius of the bend was, and from that we can figure out what the height is. And now, just using the information we know about this drill bit, I'm going to show you how to figure out the height of your bend and where to place your bend lines. The diagram I just drew is a blown up version of the bend in this diagram right here. The circle in blue represents the drill bit we use to figure out the radius of the bend. We know that the diameter of the drill bit is 17/64, which means the radius is 17/128. But what we're really interested in is the height of the bend. And by looking at the diagram, it actually turns out the height of the bend is the same as the radius of the bend at 17/128. But what we're interested in is figuring out where our bend line is. So what we actually have to do is take this value and divide it in half. And that will help us locate our bend line. All right, so now I'll actually show you how to lay out some lines on your metal. And remember, the total height of our channel can be no greater than 7 3/8, but half that is 3 11/16. That's a really important number for what we're about to lay down. We're gonna mark the center line on this piece of metal and make all of our measurements off of that. Using that center line, we need to find our bend line. The total height from the center is 3 11/16 inches, but we need to subtract the thickness of the metal and the height of the bend, which lands us at about 3 7/16 inches for our bend line.
Up next, we take what we learned and build a replacement chassis for our vintage tow truck.
During the break, we built one chassis rail of our back section using the C-channel we made, a straight piece of rectangular tubing, and we added a gusset for some strength. And currently it's sitting upside down on this table. And there's one thing I wanted to point out. This section is a straight piece of tubing. On a stock truck chassis, there's a kick-up to give clearance for the axle as the suspension travels. On a stock truck, at least on ours, it's about 9 inches between the axle and the chassis. So by using the straight section, we lose some of that room, but there's still plenty for the suspension to travel. But this is only one half of the equation, and we're gonna show you how to build the other half.
For the straight section that will go over the axle, we're using a piece of 4x2 1/8 inch wall rectangular tubing, and we're cutting it to 56 inches. This will allow for some overlap when we weld it to our newly made C-channel.
Now, to determine how much of an overlap, we'll need to pull a measurement on the original chassis. The leaf spring hanger has been cut on the old chassis, so we're gonna add a few inches to avoid doing this with our new setup.
With our measurements in hand, we'll adjust our overlap and secure our pieces so they can lay flat against each other.
As with any fabrication project, we're gonna tack our pieces first, making sure we're happy with how they sit. Then we can make our straight section of tubing a permanent part of the C-channel. Now that we've attached our rectangular tubing to our C-channel, we need to make some gussets. We're gonna make these out of 3/16 steel and cut them out on the bandsaw. There's one.
This process is a lot like a puzzle. We'll need to cut one piece at a time to ensure each subsequent piece fits perfectly against one another.
Making gussets is not an exact science. This gusset could have been twice the length. I think this length is fine, but there's a few things to keep in mind. Triangles are strong, and you should box things in if you can. We have all of our pieces laid out now, and it's time to weld them up.
With our gussets getting their final welds, we'll need to line up our new frame rails so we can build out our cross members. Now these are sized based on the original frame width, minus the thickness of the materials we're working with. For our first cross member, we're using the same 4x2 tubing we've been using throughout the process.
We're adding a second one inside of the C-channel, so this will require a different length of tubing. Before we tack this cross member in place, we need to check our measurements to ensure everything is square.
91.5. 91.5. Weld it in.
There's one last thing we're gonna add before we can call this done. A gusset made from 3/16 steel that will help add some strength around the leaf spring hangers.
Holy cats, man, that looks pretty good.
Yeah, I'm done, so I need some help moving it for a test fit.
That sounds good. Which way, left or right?
That way.
This way. Wait, that's my left is your right, though.
Sure.
Right.
It all comes down to this. All the math, the measuring, cutting and welding just to get some weld gaps right.
Right, not to mention, you already prepped the chassis, so we know where we're gonna weld. It's gonna be nice and strong. We don't have giant holes in the frame rails, so it's gonna be a whole lot safer. And we just gotta pull a quick measurement to make sure that the front and the back are nice and straight before you weld it in.
Awesome.
With our new frame section in place, we'll pull a quick measurement to make sure that the back half of the chassis is straight with the front half. 97 3/4. Weld it up.
The last thing to do is weld this chassis together, making it just as strong, if not stronger than the original. And this gives us the perfect platform to set the wrecker body back on this truck and one step closer to getting it back on the road.
Coming up, how we position 4 tires and a leaf spring suspension using one helpful measurement. All right, well, the new frame section's in the back of the truck. Jimmy welded it up. It's a lot stronger than it was before, and it's nice and straight.
So now all we have to do is get the front and rear leaf spring hangers on, and we have to do shock mounts.
Yeah, we should probably put all the suspension on the rear axle before we slide it underneath here.
Yep, I'll get the leafs and meet you back there.
It's good.
The new springs that we're installing on the tow truck are definitely heavy duty enough to tow a vehicle. These are 9-pack leaf springs with a 3,500 pound rating for each spring pack.
And we're installing these reusing the stock U-bolt plates, but we're replacing the U-bolts and nuts and just snugging them up for now. We'll torque these to spec when everything is sitting pretty under our chassis. We'll also loosely install the shackle, which will help us install the axle later.
With our axle prepped, we can prepare the front and rear leaf spring hanger mounts for a test fit. We're doing this because we're going to weld them to our new frame rails instead of riveting or bolting them to the chassis.
Many hands make light work when rolling a giant dually axle under a truck. Now, we measured the wheelbase prior to cutting off the rear end of the chassis, so we have a good idea where to set this for now.
Okay, what do we need? 22.5, right?
22.5 to the center.
We're measuring from the cut line to the center bolt hole of the leaf spring hanger. This will ensure that we tack the leaf spring hanger in the same area as our rusted out frame section.
Should we see if it fits? They're too narrow.
I think it's, these are for a 4-wheel drive truck. We've been trying to test fit the leaf springs into the hangers and we ran into a bit of an issue.
And here's what we found. They don't make every part for every vehicle. There's not a bunch of reproduction parts out there for a cab and chassis truck. So we couldn't find a set of front leaf spring hangers for our tow truck. But what we did find was a set of spring hangers for a 4-wheel drive 3/4 ton truck. What we did is welded them on, but then we found that there's an issue. This spring hanger is about 1 inch wider than the cab and chassis spring hangers. So that's just not going to work for what we have to do. So what we're going to do is take these back off. We're going to end up cutting about 1 inch out of the spring hanger, and then we're just going to weld them back right to the chassis, because that's what we were going to do in the first place. With the bracket trimmed down, we'll set these back at the 22.5 inch mark that we had them at earlier.
Go this way? Yeah. Check that out.
That's perfect.
Awesome.
All right, how close are we to the wheelbase on the other side?
That's pretty spot on.
Nice.
55.5, same as the original chassis.
Okay, tack her on.
This actually wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be, and like everything fits pretty well.
Yeah, and it was way easier to just rebuild the back half of this than it was to just fix the old part of the chassis. Mm-hmm. But we better get this welded up because we still got to get the box on it.
Yeah.
Each of the leaf spring hangers are getting welded all along the outside. We're also going to burn in as much of the inside edge as we can get to. This is probably overdoing it, but over-engineering this kind of stuff is always better than the alternative.
Up next, we reinstall the towing rig on our patina tow truck.
You're watching Carcass.
While you guys were on break, we went ahead and took care of the shocks. All we did was whip up a couple brackets, welded them to the chassis. But now it's time to do a test fit to see how that wrecker body's gonna fit on here.
And once we have the body on here, we have to figure out how to attach it, whether that be welding it directly to the chassis or making more brackets and bolting it.
But we don't have a drive shaft, so I guess we gotta push it under there. To mount the wrecker body onto our newly built chassis, we're basically gonna mount it the same way it was before, because let's face it, I'm sure this wrecker body had been on this truck its entire life, and it held together that long. So in the rear, we're gonna make some basic mounts kind of like they were before. And in the front, we're actually just gonna reuse the mounts like before. But I don't wanna work in this tiny little area, so we're gonna roll the truck back, get rid of these tires so I can take some measurements. All right, let's go about 9 inches tall, and the plate on the top will be about 8.5 inches long and 3.5 inches wide. Now to mount the bed to the chassis, we're gonna be using 2 existing bolts in the towing assembly. Now essentially, there's 2 sets of bolts that hold that towing assembly to the bed and then hold the bed to the chassis. Now the original chassis had a piece of angle iron that held this all together. Well, that's not gonna work for us because our chassis is about 1/2 inch narrower now, and there's a big piece of channeling that runs the length of the wrecker body. So if we were to use a simple piece of angle iron, it would just merely contact that piece of channeling. So a simple solution would be to cut out a set of brackets like this that have a notch in it to go around that piece of channeling. Then we'll use a piece of steel, punch out a set of holes that match the holes in the towing assembly. You wanna hold the bolts for me, Jimmy?
We're bolting the top plate to the bottom of the bed first because we already have the bed sitting where we want it. This will ensure that when we go to weld everything together, the supporting pieces will be located in the correct position.
We're gonna wait to finish weld the rear mount so we can make sure the front mounts work like they're supposed to. We're gonna be using the stock mounting plates from the original chassis and some threaded rod to make sure everything lines up.
The stock plates just hook to the inside of the C-channel, and the threaded rods are fed through them and up through the floor of the bed. All right, I got it. Then they're held down with a few washers and a nut. Well, now that we know everything lines up, we're gonna unbolt everything, pick the bed off of the chassis, weld up our rear mounts, and give everything a nice shiny coat of paint.
With everything welded up, we'll slap on a coating of paint to prevent rust and reassemble the rear end of our tow truck. Returning this crumbling work truck to a roadworthy state.
We have a lot more in store getting this tow truck back on the road. Follow along with us on this build at PowerNationTV.com.
Today on Carcass, our junkyard tow truck breathes new life with a jump in power.
Plus, we repair even more rust. Let's get you all caught up on our junkyard tow truck that we're giving a new life through some fabrication and a little imagination.
We had to dream big here with all of the rust and lack of material left on the rear half of this frame. So we got straight to work cutting out all the cancer and fabbing up a new section of our own design.
With all that metal work out of the way, we bolted up some new suspension parts to our dually axle and positioned it to where it would make this truck whole again. That's perfect.
Awesome.
We followed that up with the bed and towing assembly, bringing back that vintage tow truck look that we fell in love with.
That leads us to where we are today, where this thing is gonna live again, but with a little bit more horsepower.
That's right, we've got about 350 horsepower to go underneath the hood of this thing. We're gonna back that up with a 700 R4 4-speed automatic transmission. And the goal is to have this thing fired up by the end of the day.
And we've heard this engine's rumble before. You may remember a project from last season that we called Frankenregal. We had a lot of fun doing burnouts, and we even drove that thing through the mud. So we figured we'd take the engine out of that project and put it in this one.
And to finish off the front end, we're gonna be doing a bunch of steering upgrades. And inside the cab, well, that's gonna be a task of its own. The rusted out floorboards need a lot of attention. And I mean, it's gonna be a ton of work.
But before we fight that uphill battle, let's do the fun stuff first and get the engine in this thing.
Yep, that sounds good. The engine in our tow truck is a 305. That's similar to the one that was in our autocross Camaro project from last year. And if you remember that vehicle, when it was stock, it didn't have a whole lot of pep in its step. And let's face it, this thing came out of a junkyard. We don't know if it's ever been taken care of. Clear?
Yep. Get that junk out of here.
Now the motor came out of that pretty easy, but now we gotta scavenge the motor out of Frankenriegel. And you think that motor came out fast? This one's only gonna take a couple of minutes.
We've had the 350 Chevy in our Frankenriegel since the beginning. And we know exactly the conditions it's been operated in and how well it's been taken care of. Now this skeleton of a vehicle has just been sitting in the warehouse collecting dust, and we know the engine runs and we know it runs well. So we have no problem dropping this guy in our patina tow truck.
All clear?
Yep.
Jimmy and I are Chevy fans, and there's a good reason for that. We pulled the 305 out of the tow truck, and we're gonna be replacing it with this 350. And we know that's gonna work for a couple of reasons. The first is that GM didn't change the geometry of their V8s from the mid-50s all the way into the 90s. Take our old tow truck, for instance. This old square body could have come with a V8 like a 305 or a 350, but it also could have come with a diesel option or a big block option. So knowing this, GM set up their engine bay to handle all of those options. The other thing they did is they kept the bell housings on the transmissions the same. So if you had an automatic or a manual transmission, it would bolt up to any engine that was offered in that vehicle. So like in our tow truck, when we switch from a manual to an automatic transmission, the only thing we have to change is the transmission itself. This makes swapping pretty much any GM power plant into any full-size GM vehicle a breeze. And when they switched to the LS engine, they even kept the bell housing the same. So you can run almost any GM transmission behind it.
We're so close. Just not lining up perfect. We're off by like a third of the bolt hole. We're so close.
This engine didn't go in as easy as others have in the past. We were able to get one bolt through one of the mounts, but the second was being stubborn. Our solution is to loosen the chassis side of the mount so we can feed the bolt through. With them all lined up, we just snugged everything down.
With our engine finally mounted, it's time to install the B&M transmission that we picked up from Holley Performance. Now to get this installed, we removed the old transmission crossmember, giving us plenty of room to maneuver. Our Matco Tools transmission jack makes easy work moving the 150-pound transmission. And with all the holes lined up, we'll marry the trans to the engine.
We have one more step left to do, and that's to install a compatible crossmember for this transmission. We picked up a universal crossmember from Summit Racing. We were able to use one of the existing bolt holes from the original crossmember, but we had to drill the remaining bolt hole out with a 3/8 drill bit, allowing us to snug up the crossmember.
And since this one adjusts to the width of the chassis, we'll need to weld up the ends before calling this job done.
Up next, we get this rusty old tow truck safe for the road with some steering upgrades.
Well, the engine and trans are in the truck. I would love to fire this thing up, but there's one issue. Our gas tank just hasn't come in yet.
And also, for the short time that this truck was running and driving, there was a lot of play in the steering wheel, and that's actually coming from down here. All these steering components are so worn out, they need to be replaced, so while the truck is still on the lift, we thought we'd do it now.
Yeah, that idler arm's completely worn out.
Yeah, we gotta tear this stuff out.
If you've been following this build, you'll know that we've been dealing with a lot of rust on this vehicle. And the suspension and steering components are no exception. They all have castle nuts with cotter pins to promote safety and to make it impossible for these essential fasteners from coming loose. Well, with all that rust, it also makes it nearly impossible for us to remove them too.
After poking and prodding, pulling and hammering, we had enough. So we used a punch to drive the pin halfway, and we cut the other end of the cotter pin off. Using an air impact, we removed the castle nut, which essentially sheared the rest of the cotter pin off in the process.
Now we need to stress one thing. The way that we took the nut off the tie rod end should only be done if you're replacing the tie rod end itself. Because what happens is what's left of the cotter key gets rolled over onto the threads, making it impossible to put a nut back on it. But since we're replacing all of the steering anyways, well, that was the easiest way for us to get this out of the way.
Continuing on with our steering disassembly, we'll tackle the pitman arm next. This has a massive 1 5/16" nut holding it onto the gearbox. Then with the pitman arm puller, we'll free it up.
With that loose, we can remove the steering linkage at the idler arm. That unbolts quickly. And with a ton of hefty hits, it comes loose. Woo! This frees up the steering linkage, allowing Jimmy and I to slide it out from behind the sway bar. All out of here. Oh, it's just disgusting.
The steering box is all worn out, so we're replacing it as well. We'll drain all the fluid in the power steering pump before cutting the hoses, getting the pump out of the way for now. Next, we can tackle the gearbox. We'll unhook both hoses. Then we can remove the pinch bolt attaching the rag joint to the input shaft. With it loose, we'll use a pry bar to slide it off the shaft. Working from underneath the truck, we can finally remove the 4 bolts attaching the steering box to the chassis.
With our steering out of the way, we're gonna tackle these worn out shocks. We're replacing them with a set of Bill Steins that we picked up from summitracing.com. These are direct replacements, so they slip right into the existing mounts with a little help from a hammer and a pry bar.
We just got done installing our shocks and it's time to move on to the rest of the steering linkage. But as we were under here, we noticed that the sway bar bracket was bent out of shape. And upon closer inspection, it's actually cracked, so we're gonna have to make a new one. But that's a project for a little bit later. So for now, we're just gonna take the sway bar out and move on to our steering linkage. This will be a little hairy coming out because one of the bolts is bent. A few taps of the hammer seems to get it somewhat straight, but a cutoff wheel makes this go a whole lot quicker.
I've been working on installing all our new steering pieces that we got from Rock Auto. Now the idea is to set this back in the truck as one assembly minus one piece. We're gonna put the pitman arm on the gearbox to make sure that it's clocked in the right direction. But here's a little tip when setting up your tie rod ends. All you gotta do is measure between the 2 points and then transfer that measurement over to your new one. Then we'll just assemble everything and set it back in the truck, and that should get us pretty close. And at the end, we'll just set it on the ground, set it out for an alignment. But the first thing I gotta do is make sure this one matches that one.
While Jeremy was working on the steering linkages, I was installing the gearbox.
All right, I'm gonna grab that side.
We'll first bolt up the idler arm. This will be kept hand tight until all the components are put together.
Before we go any further, we're gonna install the pitman arm. This is the only component that we'll tighten up for now.
The linkage gets attached to the pitman arm with a castle nut, and then each knuckle receives each end of our linkage assembly.
With everything loosely attached, we can start tightening all the castle nuts. Lastly, we'll add the cotter pins. And finally, snug up the adjustment sleeves.
With a little grease added to each ball joint, our tires can go back on, resulting in a better handling tow truck when we take it for its first test drive.
Coming up, we put the finishing touches on our engine and start hacking away at the rust in the cab. Next on Carcass. We're back to work on the powertrain of our 1977 C30 tow truck. You may remember that our gas tank hadn't arrived yet, so we moved on to replacing the steering components on the front end. Well, while you were in the brake, the big box arrived.
That's right, but before we got to our fuel system, we wanted to button up the front accessory drive. Things like the cooling fan, power steering pump, and the belts were all installed.
We also threw in a brand new starter and some headers that we picked up from Summit Racing. Then we added some plug wires that we got from Holley Performance.
A radiator got thrown in the mix, getting it bolted in and plumbed up. All of this before we finally got to our fuel system. Our new tank from Summit Racing slips right in, and we hooked it up to the fuel pump.
With the flick of a key, we were able to crank up the engine and give it a couple pops of the throttle. Well, the motor runs great, so that takes care of the front. We fixed all the rust in the frame. That takes care of the back. I think it's about time we focus on the middle.
If we can take care of the floors and the crusty seat and the cracked dash, I think we'll be in pretty good shape.
Yeah, but I think before we get in here and start throwing a lot of sparks, let's get the seat out of the way. All right.
Oh, check this out.
Well, what'd you find?
51 Tennessee plate.
Holy cow.
That's old. That's cool. I love the profile of Tennessee. That's neat. Hang that up somewhere.
Yeah, put that in your shop, totally. Now, there's no getting around the fact that the floor inside of this cab has seen its better days. And that's something Jimmy and I had noticed when we picked this thing up from the junkyard. Now, we knew we'd have to replace some metal inside of the cab, we just didn't know how much. Now, after doing a little bit of digging and a lot of cleaning, this is what we've come up with. We're gonna end up replacing the floor pans, the floor braces, the lower part of the kick panels, the inner and outer rockers on both the driver's and the passenger side of the truck. But as you can see here, somebody has already replaced the outer rocker panel the wrong way. First of all, they never did install the inner rocker panel. And secondly, they never checked to see that the door would fit the opening. So when Jimmy and I picked this thing up from the junkyard, the door would barely close and it wouldn't even latch. But what does that all mean? Well, before we get to cutting out and replacing any metal inside of this cab, we gotta make sure that the door fits the opening and that it will close. Now, our doors may look a little bit different than when we took them off at the beginning of this project. Well, that's because we sent them out to our friends at Wyotech, an automotive vocational school, where instructor Mike Fisher put his expertise to work, doing some airbrushing and adding some gold leaf, blending our logo and tagline onto the doors like it originally belonged there. Well, that ain't gonna work. Now that the doors fit and they close, we're gonna add a brace to the opening to make sure that it stays in this position before we get on to cutting out the floors and the rockers. Well, now it's time to cut, and this could be pretty intimidating for a lot of you guys out there, but it's pretty simple if you follow a couple easy steps. The first thing we need to know is where to cut. We picked up these extra large floor pans from Brothers Trucks. Now they're 25 inches wide, 35.5 inches long. They're stamped to match the original floor pans, plus they're made out of thick gauge sheet steel. Now these should fit perfectly inside of our tow truck. The extra large design will help us cut all of that rusty metal away and get us to some nice clean metal so we can weld these things in. Plus, Brothers Trucks also sent us all the other sheet metal pieces so we can clean up our entire tow truck. Now the reason I pulled these out is because they're gonna tell us where to mark out our cut area. If we just line up the new pan over the old area it's replacing, well, that will give us our outline.
And once we have an outline, we'll come back and make a second mark about 1.5 inches to 2 inches in from the first line. This will give us our cut line, and more importantly, give us a flange to weld in the new floor pans.
After the break, piece by piece, we put this rusty rig back together again.
You're watching Carcass.
We're back on the rust repair for the C30 tow truck. But before we can install our floor pans that we got from Brothers Trucks, there's a couple things we need to take care of. Like removing the old kick pan. Well, now that we have all the rusty metal cut out of the cab, it's time to start replacing it with all the new parts that we got from Brothers Trucks. Now we're gonna do this in the reverse order that we took everything out. First, we're gonna start by replacing the lower kick panel so it looks like it was installed from the factory. Then we'll grab the floor brace, set that in position, make sure it lines up with the cab mount. Then we're gonna bring in the big floor pan and set that in place. Now we're not gonna weld anything in until we know that everything fits. We'll use the original fender mounting hole to help locate the kick pan, clamping it into place for now. We'll also clamp in the floor brace before bringing in the floor pan for a test fit. Now our new floor pans we got from Brothers Trucks fit really well, but that may not always be the case. So don't be afraid to grab a hammer or a dolly or even a screwdriver and help massage the new floor pan to match the old floor. But for us, in our case, these things fit perfectly. We're still not ready to weld these in quite yet because we have to take care of the inner and the outer rocker panel on this side of the truck. Yeah, that fits pretty good. We'll take the inner rocker panel out for now so we can cut the previously installed outer rocker panel free. This will let us bring in our new outer rocker panel, temporarily clamping it into place. All right, well, we're finally ready to start welding in our floors, but there's a couple different methods we could use, and there's a couple different considerations to each one of those methods. First method being, we could come in, lay the floor over the top of the old floor and weld up this entire seam. Second method is we could come back, make a trace line, cut out that piece of metal, and then butt the new floor to the old floor, weld that up solid, and that would give us a nice clean finished look in the truck. But we're not looking to restore this truck. All we're looking to do is get rid of the old rusty metal and replace it with some new stuff and make it nice and strong again. So there's one more method that we're gonna use. A third method to welding in these panels involves punching or drilling out a series of holes in each of our new panels. Then, with our welder set up to match our 18 gauge material, we can weld in all our other parts starting with our kick panel. Each hole gets filled in completely, bonding the new metal to the existing substrate. This is a repetitive process, but this is similar to how these panels were originally installed from the factory. And this rosette style of welding is the method we've chosen to install all of our panels and our floor pan. All in all, we have 250 rosette welds holding this new floor together. But we're not done with this cab yet. If you would like to follow along with this build, check us out at PowerNationTV.com.
Today on Carcass, we update the interior on our Junkyard Fine Square Body.
And we finish off the bed with a little fab and a new winch before hitting the road. Our 1977 tow truck may not look like it's made much of a transformation, but below that rusty exterior, we've made a lot of progress.
Our goal with this junkyard find is to give it new life and get it back out on the road, but with safety in mind. There were big structural concerns with the rusted out frame on this truck, and the floors in the cab weren't looking much better.
The only solution was to cut out the rust and reconstruct the rear end of the C30 chassis. This took some careful measurements and a whole lot of welding, but it made for a sturdy platform to affix our updated suspension and that reliable axle.
Perfect. Awesome. With the frame in good condition, we shifted our focus to the front end of the vehicle. We started with the power plant, removing the old 305 and replacing it with a 350 Chevy that makes 355 horsepower, easily doubling what we had in there before.
With all that extra power, we're gonna need this truck to drive straight. And all that play in the steering wheel wasn't gonna cut it. So we upgraded the gearbox and the steering links up front.
This left us with only the cab being untouched. We had a huge hole on the passenger side floor, and we even discovered that parts that had been replaced weren't done right. So we cut out a lot of the floor and called on Brothers Trucks to get some replacement pans for the cab.
With about 250 rosette welds, we were finally finished replacing the floor in the cab. And now it's time to call on Brothers Trucks one more time to finish off the interior. We're gonna pull out the old dash and replace it with a new updated vinyl one. We'll throw in a new seat and a mat to make this thing a comfy work truck again. In the rear, we'll drop in a new electric winch since the current one won't work with our upgraded transmission. And finally, we'll patch up the giant holes we made in the bed to accommodate the chassis fix we made earlier. Now we've chosen to go with Brothers Trucks for our interior refresh because they house thousands of high quality, classic GMC and Chevy truck parts from 1947 to 1987. And since our cab is a 1977, it seemed like a no-brainer. Now the dash inside of our tow truck looks like it has been there its entire life. So we picked up a bunch of pieces to update the inside of our cab, like a new dash pad that's made of foam and a high quality vinyl, a new instrument bezel with a new lens so we can see our gauges again, and a whole bunch of new gauges so we can give our truck that factory fresh look. And finally, we picked up a classic style steering wheel and some door seals to help keep the noise and the elements out. Now there's a couple pieces of the interior that we are gonna keep. So before we put anything together out here, we're gonna ditch that worn out interior. To get to the instrument cluster, we'll need to remove a few trim pieces, including the instrument bezel. The dash pad comes off next, but this is one of the items that we'll come back to later. Now we can finally tackle the instrument cluster. A few screws hold it into place, but on the back side, we'll need to unhook the electrical connection, the oil pressure line, and the speedometer cable. Lastly, we'll use a steering wheel puller to remove the steering wheel before giving our column a rattle can paint job.
At the bench, we're gonna go ahead and install the new goodies we got from Brothers Trucks. To gain access to our gauges, we need to remove the front lens and the gauge bezel. Tackling the speedometer first. This is a quick and easy replacement using all the existing hardware. In fact, all these gauges are all easy to replace. Each one fits in the old location using the existing electrical tabs and original hardware.
With our gauge cluster wrapped up, we're about ready to install everything back in the truck. But there's one thing that we want to transfer over from the original dash. The original molding still looks great, and we thought it would look good in our new vinyl dash that we got from Brothers Trucks.
Before we put anything back in the cab of our tow truck, we're gonna freshen up the floor with some truck bed coating.
This will go well with all the new trim pieces we'll be putting in here.
Now we'll put everything back in the vehicle in the reverse order that it was taken out. That means the instrument cluster is first. We'll need to hook up the wiring harness, the speedometer cable, and we'll need to tighten down the oil pressure feed line.
So now the back of the dash needs to clip in. Up here some. Oh, like that's like that. Oh, that was simple enough. Yeah, that's it right there.
With our vinyl dash in place, we can add the instrument bezel. It sits snug under the dash and against the lens.
To finish off our dash, we'll add a new steering wheel we picked up from Brothers Trucks. It's snugged down with a 7/8 socket. Then we'll add the bracket for the horn button, along with the cap.
One of the last pieces is a rubber floor mat, which fits our floors nicely. And the last piece to finish off the cab, a brand new bench seat we picked up from Summit Racing. There we go.
That finishes up our upgraded interior, leaving us with a beautifully stitched seat, a renewed dash, plus an upgraded steering wheel and instrument cluster.
Up next, we fixed this mess out back with a little bit of fab work. If you remember back when we worked on the chassis, we cut 2 huge holes in the back of the bed. The reason why we had to do that is because the rear spring shackles were actually welded to the back of the bed. And we didn't address it at first, but now that the truck is almost done, we have to fix it. So instead of just patching these holes or building a box to go around the shackle, we're just gonna cut off these 3 leftover sections and completely rebuild the back end using a similar material, 3/16 steel. So the first step is cutting.
To make this cut, we're gonna use our Matco 20-volt grinder with a cutoff wheel. Now we aren't gonna immediately plunge the grinder into this 3/16 steel. We're gonna first score a line, creating a nice guide for us to follow when we come back around again with a final plunge cut.
There are a few safety tips when making cuts like this. First, we always orient the grinder so the disc is cutting away from us. In this case, it's making the cut in a downward direction. This is not only safer, but helps direct sparks away from you. Second, when cutting metal or any material for that matter, you need to be aware of stresses in the material. When things separate, that's a good thing, but when stresses cause your material to pinch your cutting disc, well, that's where you can run into trouble. Lastly, you should always watch where your feet are. There's nothing worse than a broken toe from a hunk of metal that slips from your hand as you set it down.
With safety aside, all we need to do is clean up our edges with a flap disc, and we're left with a clean plate to form our back end. We're gonna use 3/16 steel to build out this rear end, and that starts with cutting a 48 by 17-inch piece.
The first piece is what we'll build everything else off of. So to secure it, we'll tack it to the frame, but we're placing the tacks in an easy location for the future owner to easily cut away later.
With that in place, we can cut out the left piece. With the same 3/16 steel plate, we'll cut a 15 by 17-inch piece and fit it to the driver's side. With that tacked in, we can tackle the passenger side. This will receive a number of tacks as well.
Now that we're done with the main panels, it's time to cap off the top with some smaller pieces to make it look complete. We're gonna make the top out of 3 separate pieces, one for each end and one in the middle. These pieces are gonna be kind of irregular in shape, so it'll take some time and test fitting to get it right. So to start, we're gonna make some templates out of cardboard. We traced our cardboard shapes on some more 3/16 steel, and we cut them out at the bandsaw, cutting on the inside edge of the line. With it cut out, we can test fit our piece and tack it in.
Now, projects like this don't always line up perfectly, and some brute force is expected to close some minor gaps. Just be mindful of the material that you're using to help do this. You don't want to melt something or have something catch on fire from the heat of the weld.
With our tougher pieces out of the way, we have one more piece that's going to be about 39 7/8 inches long, and it'll pretty much be a rectangle. But because this edge I did a freehand cut on, it'll take some grinding to get it to fit just right. And also, while I'm doing that, I'm going to show you a little grinding trick to help you with butt welds. We cut out a 39 by 3 1/4 inch piece of 3/16 steel, cleaning up the edge with a grinder. Take a little bit there. Knowing where we need to trim back our piece to match the profile of the bed, we'll grind back to our line and give it another test fit. That looks pretty good. So this plate is fitting pretty well now, but there's one thing left that I have to do. I'm gonna put a chamfer on all the edges where there's gonna be a butt weld, and there's a reason for that. Once you weld over that, it'll allow the weld to lay a little bit flatter and it'll look a lot cleaner.
Something to note while you're welding. If you're using magnets like we are here, you're going to want to remove them when you're welding near them. These things like to disrupt the arc and give you all kinds of headaches.
Let me show you why we put a bevel on the pieces in a butt joint. And to first illustrate that, I'll show you an open corner joint. An open corner joint is nice because there's a lot of area for the filler material to go, and it gives us a nice line to follow when we're welding. But with a normal butt joint, we don't really have that benefit, because when you try to weld it, the filler material kind of builds up on top of it and it doesn't look that great. So when we put a bevel on it, it gives us a nice line to follow, and it gives a good space for the filler material to go. You'll notice as we weld up this butt joint, the filler material caps off the beveled area nicely, leaving a flatter profile than if we were just to butt the two pieces together.
This part of the project is nearly done, and we have a ton of welding to do, merging each gap with good, strong welds.
Rebuilding the chassis of this truck was necessary, and it left us with a less than ideal situation. But now with the back of this truck closed off, we're almost ready to tow some cars.
Coming up, we yank out the old mechanical winch and replace it with an electric variant.
This truck is almost ready to hit the road again, but we have to address one important feature to make this truck fully functional, and that's the winch system. The original winch on this truck was powered by a PTO or power takeoff shaft coming off of the manual transmission. Since we swapped over to an automatic, it doesn't have that feature. So what we're gonna do is replace this winch with an electric winch, which is nice because all we have to worry about is a battery.
The original mechanical winch was controlled by these two levers in the back of the truck. Jimmy and I love the fact that they're still back here. It makes this truck pretty nostalgic. But what we want to do is find a way to use these two levers to control our electric winch. Now we've got a little bit of investigative work to do before we figure this all out.
All right, so red and white should put the winch out.
Got it.
All right, so this is what we have figured out. If we jump the red and the white, the winch goes out. If we jump the red and the green, the winch comes back in.
And if we flip this switch and jump the white and the blue, the compressor turns on.
Just like that. Now all we gotta do is figure out how to put this in the truck.
That thing is so heavy. Can you grab that side? You good there?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Come on, He-Man. Holy cow. With our old winch gone, we got to come up with a way to install our new winch. That's going to be as simple as a couple of plates and a couple of gussets. So what we're going to do is bolt these two brackets to our new winch. We'll weld them onto the channel that the old winch came off of, and then we're just going to weld on a couple gussets for some strength. To make the original levers work in the back of the tow truck, we're going to be using a set of switches that we got from AutoZone. Now these Duralast switches are a basic on and off switch. So when we push the button, the winch will engage. Now these switches have a protective rubber coating on the back and a waterproof cap. And they're reliable even under the harshest conditions. So these switches will work great in the back of our tow truck when they're exposed to the elements.
Check this out. This thing's gonna be functional and it's gonna look cool too.
Yeah, dude, nice job painting that to match the truck. That's awesome.
All right, hit it.
Check this out, we got a fully functional tow truck again. And we're almost ready to hit the road.
Yeah, that's a nice piece.
After the break, we hit the road in our square body junkyard rescue.
And we're bound to get our hands dirty. Our tow truck is just about ready to hit the road, but there's one little change that both Jeremy and I wanted to make to the patinaed exterior. We wanted to strip down the wheels to bare metal and give it a little rattle can refresh to make the outside look like they just came fresh from the factory.
And the tires that we chose to wrap them with are an Armstrong True Track HT that we got from Tire Streets. They have a special engineered tread design that provides greater towing ability on the highway. The curved profile of the tread also increases rigidity. And there's a noise blocking bar on the tire shoulder that delays premature wear and results in a quieter ride. Wow, look at that thing.
You ready to go?
Yeah, but if it's cool with you, I think I'm gonna drive this time.
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. And I totally claimed us a parking spot.
Oh, that's neat.
Well, the truck is done and we're actually driving it now. It drives out good. It's got way more power than it did before.
Yeah.
Not that we could really base it off of much because we drove it onto the trailer, but I like it.
Yeah, me too. It's safe.
It's definitely safer than it was before.
Obviously, this truck isn't worth fully restoring, but you know, if you want to make it drivable, you know, the chassis stuff and everything, and putting floors in it, that's really as far as you want to take it. Otherwise, you know, it's just kind of too much time investment for what you're going to get out of it.
Right. So really, the truck, for what it was worth putting some time and effort into to get it back on the road. But to make it perfect,
just buy a better truck.
You just buy a better truck.
Yeah.
I love the build. Love the idea that we pulled it out of the junkyard.
Yeah.
And resurrected it, if you will. Well, the truck made it back with flying colors. But what in the world? Who is parked in our spot?
I believe that's Mr. Tommy.
Oh, we can take care of that. We got a tow truck.
Come on back. Crank it. We're good. Tow truck, pretty convenient.
It's our parking spot now.
I guess, yeah. There's a sign there, isn't there?
Yeah, right.
For more builds like this, check out PowerNationTV.com.